Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Prevail's 2025 CMMC Summit. It's truly a privilege to have so many of you here today, thousands of attendees from across the defense industrial base, from primes to small manufacturers, all committed to one common goal of protecting our nation's information and preparing for the future of secure defense contracting. We know your time is valuable, and the timing of this event could not be more important. In just a few short weeks, on November 10th, CMMC will officially become a regulation, ready to be incorporated into defense contracts. After years of anticipation, this milestone marks a turning point. Cybersecurity will no longer be aspirational, it will be a contractual requirement. So, what's the purpose of today? Our goal for today is simple but essential. We want every attendee to leave with a crystal clear understanding of what this regulation demands, how to prepare to comply, and what to expect when you are being assessed. We have designed the day so that everything that you hear, every panel, every keynote, every breakout is action-oriented and precise. There is no time for ambiguity. The regulation is real, the timelines are near, and the need for clarity is absolute. That's why our speakers and our team at Prevail have spent weeks and indeed months preparing for concise, fact-based sessions to help you understand and act. So how are we going to structure the day? We've organized the day into two parallel tracks. After the keynotes, you can attend the foundation track for organizations that are just beginning their compliance journey, and the advanced track for those that are further along and working to ensure that they receive level 2 and meet all 110 controls. And every session includes a certified third-party assessor, a C3PAO, to ensure that what you hear reflects the latest, most accurate interpretation of the regulations and their assessments. It takes a village. Events like these truly take a village. I want to extend a heartfelt thank you to our gold, silver, and bronze sponsors. It means a lot to us. We're also deeply grateful to the NIST MEPs from Texas and Virginia for their incredible collaboration and outreach across the DIB. Your on-the-ground support for small and medium-sized manufacturers and your leadership in helping them prepare for CMMC is deeply appreciated. Please join me in giving them all a warm round of applause. And that brings us to our first keynote. To start the day, we have Mr. Michael Gruden. It's my great honor to introduce Michael, who's a partner at the law firm of Crowell and Mooring and one of the nation's foremost experts in cybersecurity and federal contracting. Michael brings nearly 15 years of experience from the Department of Defense, Homeland Security, and now advises many of the country's leading defense contractors and technology companies on CMMC compliance, data security, and cyber readiness. He also serves on the appeals board for the CMMC framework accreditation body, the Cyber AB. And so few people understand the regulation as deeply or can explain it as clearly as Michael. This morning, Michael will walk us through exactly what the new CMMC regulation is, what it asks of level 2 contractors, and what readiness really means. Please join me in welcoming Michael Gruden.
Thanks so much, Sanjeev, and thanks to the entire Prevail team for this wonderful opportunity to talk with people that I love talking to, which really is the defense industrial base, and educating and collaborating on how to meet and interpret and understand the government's evolving cybersecurity requirements. And that's what we're here to do today, all of us. But starting up here with sort of CMMC Level 2, how to start preparing. We really want to walk through the underlying requirements that are the backbone of the CMMC program. And to do that, we want to start off first, and if I get this into presentation mode, we'll do exactly that, where I thought it would be helpful to start off with the cybersecurity retrospective. And what I mean by that is let's go back over the last decade, because there's been significant activity within the Department of Defense. And like Sanjeev meant, I spent 5 years there as a branch chief overseeing all IT acquisitions. So really have a unique lens of understanding how the DoD has been interpreting and applying these security requirements. But looking over here on this diagram on the far left, where we have a reference to safeguarding CUI, that was again the seminal time back in 2013 where the Defense Department first released a contracting clause that was focused around securing controlled and classified information, otherwise known as CUI. Again, that really is the crown jewels that the government is really focused on right now protecting, and that's the core focus of CMMC. We'll unpack some of these requirements in the next slides, but I wanted to again start here to really evolve and unpack sort of how it started and where we got to where we're going today. So again, on the far left was a safeguarding clause, 252.204-7012. Later on in 2020, the government found that again, and more so the DoD, found that CUI was still vulnerable on contractor information systems, that there still was a prevalence of cyber attacks. And so the government determined we need another mechanism to safeguard this data. We can no longer sort of distrust that contractors are implementing these requirements, but we want to implement a mechanism that will actually verify and externally assess that these controls are accurately being implemented. So in 2020, CMMC was originally introduced as CMMC 1.0, as many of us now refer to it. However, there was a lot of industry feedback and it looks very different from what it looks like today. But as a result, that was sort of, again, an important part of the timeline of DoD cyber maturity. Around that same time in 2020, two other contract clauses were introduced that actually implemented requirements for contractors to actually assess their compliance against how they've implemented this underlying cybersecurity standard, NIST 800-171. So that was in existence for the past 5 years. And thereafter, in 2021, the Department of Justice implemented a new program referred to as the Civil Cyber Fraud Initiative. And really what that did was it worked in concert with the Defense Department to in some ways incentivize the defense industrial base to implement these controls more fervently because, again, they found, again, a prevalence of data breaches and a lack of implementation of these controls. And essentially what the DOJ said was that we're going to incentivize the contractor community by essentially bringing forth penalties and enforcement actions for cyber non-compliance, where we have these requirements in express contracts and contractors have allegedly failed to implement them. Moving further down to the CMMC program rule, last October of 24 was actually when the CMMC program rule itself was unveiled. That had significant impact in terms of moving forward the broader CMMC requirements. And just this past September, the CMMC acquisition rule was released. And that brings us to today, where we want to talk about these requirements and sort of what they mean. So moving on to our next slide, going back initially to the DFARS safeguarding clause, wanting to overview what that requires because it really is foundational to inform present day the CMMC requirements. Under the 7012 clause, there's three core requirements: to implement adequate security, to rapidly report cyber incidents, which actually is what we spent a lot of other time counseling companies on when to notify governments of various types of potential cyber incidents affecting CUI, and then flowing down these requirements to your supply chain. That again has been around now for the past decade, but many of those same requirements apply now, which include having a written system security plan that describes how you've implemented those underlying NIST security controls, or if you have your data in the cloud, ensuring that it meets the FedRAMP moderate baseline or its equivalency. Moving forward now to the DoD assessment requirements that I was referring to. Back in 2020, the DoD issued two different clauses, DFARS 252.204-7019, which was a solicitation provision, and then DFARS 252.204-7020, which was again a contract clause that required companies to not only have written documentation like that system security plan that describes how you've implemented all 110 security controls within that cyber standard, NIST 800-171, but you also had to conduct a score. You had to score yourself using a government assessment methodology and then upload that score into a government portal. In addition to that, this clause also enabled the government or afforded them the right to conduct on-site audits. Some of you out there might be familiar with the Defense Industrial Base Cybersecurity Assessment Center, otherwise known as DIBCAC. When the 7020 clause was released, we began seeing many companies being contacted by DIBCAC, which is managed through the Defense Contract Management Agency, asking contractors to actually allow them to conduct on-site assessments of how they've implemented these cybersecurity requirements. This again is foreshadowing kind of present-day CMMC requirements that we're going to now unpack. And that leads us here to the Cybersecurity Maturity Model certification. As I mentioned now, it's been sort of a 5-year journey where again, version 1.0 was released in November of 2020. Thereafter, there was the announcement of version 2.0 in November 21. However, again, because this requirement had such a widespread impact on the defense community, there was significant industry feedback, notice and comments periods where, again, the Defense Department took industry feedback and comments, they modified the rule, they modified the clauses, and then over the last year, there's been an iterative process of then releasing various legislation that have, again, created the foundation for the CMMC program. And again, looking there in the third bullet, the first being the 32 CFR CMMC final rule. That was the rule that finalized the CMMC program itself. And what I mean by that was that then gave authority to those external assessors, referred to as certified third-party assessment organizations, to then be able to assess organizations against this new documented standard, and then to actually issue certifications or certificates of compliance with the CMMC requirements. In addition to that, the CMMC program will also formalize the assessment and scoping guides, as well as other aspects of the broader CMMC program. Now, at the very bottom bullet, just this past September, 48 CFRs was finalized, which is, again, the CMMC acquisition rule, as we refer to it. And what that did was it formalized an existing DFARS clause 252.204-7021, which will now come into effect November 10th of this year. As Sanjeev mentioned, there will be a phased rollout that we're looking forward to. And essentially, over the next 4 years, there will be a progressive expansion of CMMC requirements and essentially all contracts that will then handle controlled and classified information. But what we're looking to predominantly for this first year is that there will largely be self-assessment requirements that will be very similar to the 70/20 clause that I had mentioned a little while ago. But again, that this self-assessment will not be solely against NIST 171, but against that CMMC assessment and scoping guide, as well as NIST 171 and its corollary assessment guide, referred to as NIST 800-171A. So as I've been mentioning here, and this might look a little familiar to you, similar to the 7012 clause, the security requirements of CMMC Level 2 are quite similar. And what we mean by that is there's actually 3 different levels of CMMC, but the one that sort of is the predominant requirement for any contractor that will be handling controlled unclassified information is CMMC Level 2. And there are 2 different aspects that are sort of called out within the program that describe the security requirements. The first is to fully implement all 110 security controls from that same cyber standard that I was mentioning, NIST 800-171. And particularly, I want to call out revision 2. There is a more mature version. There's a revision 3 that has been published by the National Institutes of Standards and Technologies. However, the Defense Department has stated that currently, present day, that all CMMC contractors that are looking to get certified have to only now align to revision 2 of the cybersecurity standard. So if you have NIST 800-171, if you have CUI on your network, on premises as we refer to it, the requirement is to then implement these requirements on that network. However, if you have CUI and it's not only locally on your network, but it's also in the cloud, think some type of cloud-based application or some solution like Prevail. If you have CUI in the cloud, the requirement is to meet the FedRAMP moderate baseline or its equivalency or higher. And what we mean by that is there's FedRAMP moderate requirements, and there's also FedRAMP high for certain types of CUI that require that. But again, the core requirement, again, is to have either your local network meeting NIST 171, or if you have your CUI in the cloud, that it also needs to meet the FedRAMP moderate baseline or its equivalency. What we increasingly see sort of in today's modernity of technology, of having local networks, having cloud solutions, is that actually both requirements apply, meaning that if you have CUI in your local network, you need to meet NIST 171. If you have some cloud solutions or cloud storage like Prevail, it would need to meet that FedRAMP moderate baseline. So again, these are the foundational requirements that companies are working towards. And what we mean by working towards is having written policies and plans that describe how you do that. First, within your system security plan, identifying and describing how you've implemented these controls, also depicting your network architecture, your network topology. And what we mean by that is accurately capturing how your CUI exists on your network and where it flows and where it cannot. Because again, defining your boundaries is integral to really determining future state, how you will be assessed by an assessor, and also how you would need to conduct your own self-assessment. So as I mentioned earlier, there will be several different types of assessment requirements under CMMC Level 2. The predominant requirement initially will be to have self-assessments. And then thereafter, there will be a broader expansion to have certified third-party assessments. Overall, how the government sort of has estimated this in time over the next 4 years is that 95% of future state contracts will require that external C3PO assessment, and only 5% will only allow a self-assessment over the maturity over the next 4 years. But for this first year of phased implementation, a majority of contractors will likely only see a self-assessment requirement. So these are things to plan for. But the things that we want to call out, though, is that again, for a certification assessment, that will need to be conducted every 3 years. So again, if you have a certification assessment conducted by the end of this year, in 3 years' time, you'll have to have another assessment conducted. Differently, for self-assessments, they will need to be conducted every year annually. So again, there are two different regimes here that you'll want to be mindful of and be planning for. One thing that we wanted to call out, though, that's unique about CMMC that is different from the prior DFARS safeguarding clause that I was mentioning, that 252, 204-7012, is that under CMMC, there's a requirement to complete affirmations. And what we mean by that is there's a requirement that at each time of a certification at level 1, level 2, and even level 3, if required, that an affirming official for the company actually complete an affirmation in addition to your external certification and upload that to a government portal. And what that affirmation conveys or states is that everything that has been assessed, everything that has been produced as evidence is accurate and complete. And in addition to that, within this final CMMC clause rule that was just finalized, the government takes that one step further and they state that contractors must maintain their current status. And what that means is that there's been no deviation or degradation of your security controls, and that will all be tied to this affirmation. And again, looking at that second bullet, one thing we want to call out is that, again, submitting that affirmation is sort of an eligibility criteria, meaning if you don't submit that, you will be ineligible for future contract awards, in addition to having to have your actual CMMC certificate. So this really is a no-go, no-go requirement. But why this matters is when we think about the DOJ Civil Cyber Fraud Initiative that I was mentioning, we've seen so much activity over the last 5 years from the Department of Justice where they brought forth enforcement actions where we're seeing settlements now for tens of millions of dollars where contractors have allegedly not complied with these same underlying cybersecurity requirements, meaning they have not fully implemented NIST 171, or they did not use cloud services that met the FedRAMP moderate baseline or its equivalency. But again, having this affirmation is one additional legal compliance hook for a company, because again, here we are acknowledging to the government that yes, we're doing this accurately and completely, such that if the government did conduct some type of investigation, or if there was a whistleblower complaint, meaning an internal individual that reported to the Department of Justice, and then the Department of Justice intervened in that case, these affirmations would be another sort of way of sort of elevating that risk for a company. And so we say that to stress the importance that it's critical to get your documentation right and to know that the compliance that you've implemented is accurate and complete. Wanting to transition now again to sort of like core takeaways to consider for CMMC certification. And there's 5 things here that we would recommend that you think through. The first is knowing your data. And what we mean by that is knowing what controlled and classified information that you have. And for those of you that are not familiar, anything for it to be CUI, it's really information that aligns with a law of regulation or government-wide policy, but it should be affirmatively marked by the government or a higher tier contractor. However, that's not always the case. Depending upon the industry that you're working in or the type of data that you're handling, even the data itself by default may be CUI, and part of that burden relies sort of on a contractor to identify it. There's actually a CUI registry that's governed by the by NARA, the National Administration for Records Administration, and it includes over 100 categories and subcategories of CUI. And again, often with these determinations, we actually state that, again, it's a legal function, because again, for something to be deemed CUI, it has to align with an existing law or underlying federal regulation. So when in doubt, seek outside counsel for that to determine that, but always go back to your contracts to see what has been affirmatively marked within your statement of work or other contract documents or attachments. The other recommendation we would have here is to really know your network. And what we mean by that is know where your regulated data exists, but know where it traverses on your network. What we've often found when we have assisted clients under attorney-client privilege is that when we begin having interviews, when we begin discussing process flow and workflows and seeing where CUI transits, we often have found that, again, it's in often different places or actually much more broadly than what is often first realized. And so that's why it's really critical to take the time to identify your data and then to know where it rests on your network, where it's transiting, what external solutions you have that data could flow to and where it exists, because all of that will then help sort of create a roadmap for your broader CMMC compliance strategy. The next recommendation is to know your solutions. And what we mean by that is, again, while reflecting and conducting a CMMC readiness assessment initially to sort of see where you are and what your gaps are, know what you need technically and technologically in order to get you to full compliance. For some companies, it might be to migrate to an enclave solution like Prevail, where your data is sort of residing in the cloud, it's staying there, it's not being pulled down locally to your network, and it's residing in the cloud, such that, again, it sort of decreases your overall compliance burden and it overall can limit your broader legal compliance risk. For other companies, depending upon sort of operational need or manufacturing, your data might need to be in operational technology. It might need to be in other aspects of your network. But until you kind of run through that process flow, you won't really know what solutions you need and how to get there. But also, sometimes when implementing these requirements, they are not always sort of immediately turn switch solutions, meaning that they will require some time to implement, to test internally, and to fully roll out. So you'll want to build in that timeline when you're working towards your broader compliance. And having said compliance, that leads us into that fourth recommendation, which is to know your compliance requirements. And what we mean by that is to actually read your contracts. Again, as a former contracting officer, I love a good contract. I can't resist getting in them and rifling through the various attachments and sections of the contract. And to many of you, I'm sure that your eyes are glazing over and you're saying this is as boring as it can get, right? But it's so critical that actually once you open up your contracts, you might be shocked to see that there are additional requirements in addition to the DFARS 7012 clause, or in addition to CMMC Level 2. Oftentimes, we've seen that certain companies, depending upon the nature of the work they're performing or the type of data they're handling, might have additional requirements, meaning their data might have to reside exclusively in the continental US, or only US persons can access that data, or there might be other heightened requirements in addition to CMMC or in addition to NIST Standard 171. So again, until you read your contracts and review them, you won't fully know the breadth of the requirements that you have to meet. The last requirement or the last recommendation here of a takeaway to consider would be seeking outside counsel to have either a readiness assessment or a certification assessment under attorney-client privilege. The reason why we mention that is, again, having that sort of insulation of privilege really can create a no-fault environment. And what we mean by that is, again, it can lower the guard down of IT personnel when you're trying to troubleshoot and sort of get to full compliance, where, again, it's a no-fault environment. And what we mean by that is, again, looking to the DOJ civil cyber fraud, many of those settlements that are the aspects of evidence that are foundational to that are unprivileged cybersecurity assessment reports. And so, again, where we've seen the government obtain those through legal discovery and then find inconsistencies where the government would state, you've uploaded a prior self-assessment under the DFARS 7020 clause, which actually contradicts this separate external finding that you did not meet all these controls. And so, again, any degree of delta there is where the government has found non-compliance and brought forth many of these cases. So again, having these readiness assessments under privilege and certification assessments helps mitigate much of that risk, such that you can move more expeditiously to compliance and more of a no-fault environment. So that's most of what we have here today to sort of kick things off. But again, many thanks to Sanjeev. I'm excited to hear what Matt Travis has to say from the Cyber AV. He's a great friend. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me on either via email, phone, or LinkedIn. And again, thanks to Prevail and Sanjeev for the opportunity.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. Really clear and crisp presentation. I have one question for you.
Yeah, what's that?
In the audience would have heard you say there's a 4-year rollout.
Correct.
And I want you to clarify, what does that mean for an entity that is either holding a defense contract that has DFAR 7012? Does that mean that they can say, well, I got 3 years more to go and get assessed? How should they think about it? And so think about a contractor that has either DFAR 7012 right now, or is thinking of bidding on a contract that has CMMC in the coming years, whether it be 1, 2, 3, or 4.
Excellent question, Steve. Thank you for that. So, I mean, to your question, starting out, if you have the 70-12 clause in your contract today, or you've had it in your contracts for the last 5 years or a decade, you're already required to meet these requirements. So this should not be a surprise. More so, there's no time to wait because you already are legally obligated to meet these requirements. To your second question, though, about there's a 4-year phased implementation, yes, that's correct. But essentially, if you want to receive current DoD contracts, you need to have that minimum a self-assessment that you're preparing towards to obtain that self-assessment certification or have that external certification in hand. Otherwise, you will be ineligible for future DoD contracting opportunities. And what we mean by that is, again, it's likely that you will see these CMMC requirements in contract solicitations this year. Even what we were discussing about the 4-year rollout, that's sort of more broadly across every single contract carte blanche. But again, for the core contracts, we're likely to see them this year, and particularly for subcontractors or suppliers, you're going to likely see those inquiries from your higher tier prime contractors or higher tier subcontractors because they will likely receive these requirements in their contracts. So really, the time for compliance is now. This is the time to again, identify your solutions and to refine your documentation.
And so, Michael, just from our own experience, we are seeing that. I mean, we have several thousand customers, but already 50 have achieved CMMC compliance. So these are the 50 customers that went through the assessments, got the assessments done. But the rest of those several thousand are saying, we're getting ready for it. And so if the contract that asks for CMMC is 2 years from now, they can go seek an assessment a year and a half, 2 years from now. But the importance is that they are ready, and most of these folks have obviously DFARS 7012 clauses, and so therefore they are prepared in case the current contract asks them for evidence, then they have it, and if CMMC is coming in a future contract, they're ready to bid for it. Well, again, thank you so very much, Michael. As
Thank you,
you've
Sanjeev.
reminded us, CMMC isn't just a compliance exercise. It's a new language of trust between the Department of Defense and its partners. And now that we understand what the regulation requires, it's time to turn our attention in the second keynote to how it will be implemented and assessed. So thank you very much, Michael. And we're over to our second keynote. The audience, please stay on as our second speaker, Matt Travis from CyberAB, joins, which should happen in literally a minute. Thank you again, Michael.
Thank you, Sanjeev.